Thanks for tuning in to the Oxygen Alliance YouTube channel, where we share the Concentrator Talk virtual meeting hosted every Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. Central African Time. In the talk, we discuss different aspects of oxygen concentrator assessment, use, and maintenance. And please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notifications bell. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Concentrator Talk, brought to you by the Oxygen Alliance. My name is Mwawi Lungu, and I'm very pleased to be hosting the call today. I am joined by my colleagues, Amapreet Rai and Timothy Mtonga, along with our technicians from OpenO2 and Sunrise. So on the technicians panel today, we have Paulina Mohosho, Masofa Mojaji joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. We have Kowinda Singh joining us from Chandigarh, India, and Cynthia Chikomoni, Daphne Magela, and Aubrey Chinkunda joining us from Lilongwe, Malawi. So in case you are new to the Concentrator Talk, so this is a virtual meeting that we host every Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. Central African Time. And here we discuss the different aspects of concentrator assessment, use, and maintenance. So if you have any issues with an oxygen concentrator that you would like us to help you out with, you can always send those problems to us in advance through our email address, info@oxygenalliance.org, and we will do our best to answer them. If you have some questions or comments that you would like to raise during the call, you are always free to do that. Or you can either paste it in the chat and I can read it out for the group to hear. All right, so moving on to our questions now. So our first question says, how can one compare between oxygen concentrators and cylinders, since both are used for administering oxygen therapy? So I'll ask Paulina to respond to this one.
Thank you, Mabi. Oxygen tanks and oxygen concentrators are medical devices that offer oxygen therapy for patients who are unable to get enough oxygen into their bodies on their own. Tanks and oxygen concentrators specifically are uniquely designed to deliver oxygen to patients at home, on the go, or when being transferred between medical sites. Oxygen tanks are metal tanks containing pressurized oxygen. To use these tanks, a line of tubing is connected to the tank at one end and then to a nasal cannula or oxygen mask at the other end. This allows the oxygen in the tank to be delivered directly into the patient's nose. Personal oxygen tanks are typically mounted on a trolley or other wheel-based devices that allows them to be easily transported by the caregiver. So here are some of the advantages of oxygen tanks. The first advantage is that it requires no power. One of the most distinct advantages of oxygen tank is that they take advantage of the pressurized oxygen within them to operate, so they do not need power to operate. The second advantage is that they are silent. Since oxygen tanks are simply delivering their content at a specific rate, there are no beeps and there are no loud sounds associated with using oxygen tanks. So now we will go through some of the disadvantages of the oxygen tank. The first one is that the oxygen tank is heavy. And this is one of the most commonly noted disadvantage of oxygen tanks. Their weight and their portability, that is the disadvantage. This means that lifting the tank can be challenging due to the weight of the devices. The second disadvantage is that they are limited to their content. So oxygen tanks only contain a limited amount of oxygen. And once the tank has been depleted, it has to be refilled or replaced with a new one. The third disadvantage is that it is greater, it has a greater cost over time. Oxygen tanks need to be refilled or replaced frequently. Their initial low price adds up over time to make their cost higher in the long term. So now we will go through the oxygen concentrators. So the oxygen concentrator dispense oxygen in almost exactly the same way that the oxygen tank do, delivering oxygen directly to the patient via the same nasolar cannula or facial mask. However, where the oxygen tank contains a fixed amount of pressurized oxygen, concentrators produce oxygen by collecting air from the surrounding and removing the excess nitrogen from it and store it in a tank before delivering it to the patient. So this removes the need for a replacement or refilling of the tank. The advantages of the oxygen concentrator is that it has unlimited oxygen. The ability of the oxygen concentrator to continuously draw in and treat air ensures that, unlike oxygen tank, the concentrator will never run out of oxygen as long as all the parts involved in filtering out the nitrogen are working perfectly. It runs at a lower cost since there will be no need to frequently refill the tank as we do with oxygen cylinders. The second advantage is that it's lightweight. Oxygen concentrators are notably lighter and more portable than most oxygen tanks. Because they do not rely on pressurized oxygen, concentrators do not require a dense metal tank to store the oxygen. Hence they are lightweight. The third advantage is that these devices, oxygen concentrators, are best for home treatment than cylinders due to its portability and unceasing generation of oxygen. The concentrator, like the oxygen tank, has some disadvantages, and here are some of the disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that power is required. Oxygen concentrators do not use pressurized oxygen within the tank. Oxygen concentrators must rely on electric power to perform their air filtering and oxygen flow. In case of a power outage, oxygen delivery is compromised if there is no backup source of power. The second disadvantage is that they are noisy. Oxygen concentrators collect oxygen from air and then filter and compress it for the user. This process can often be noisy due to the various components at work. Squeaking sound can be disturbing to the patient when the compressor kits have to be replaced. So these are the differences between the oxygen tank and the oxygen concentrator. I hope all this information will help in understanding what the difference is in between the two. Thank you, Madi.
Thank you very much, Paulina. That was very informative. I hope they understood. But just in case we have some questions or comments that we'd like to make, we are always free to come off mute, or you can type it in the chat, and then Paulina will help to answer all follow-up questions that you may have. All right, it seems we do not have any questions there, so we'll be moving on to our second question. So the question says, I am a technician at a certain mission hospital. We received a donation of new olive 10 concentrators at our hospital. It has been a few months now, and one of the concentrators at the pediatric ward raises an alarm after being switched on for some time, and it gets hot. When switched off and on again, the alarm goes away, but sometimes it comes back. When the concentrator was brought to the workshop, I troubleshooted it, but everything was working just fine. I switched it on and observed it for 5 hours straight, and it never raised an alarm, and the purity was 95.6. What might have caused the problem? So I will ask Daphne to answer this one.
Thank you, Maui. Every concentrator has suitable humidity and temperature it can best operate in. If the environment the concentrator is placed in has a high humidity and temperature, the concentrator's performance will be affected. If the concentrator is being used without enough space for air circulation around it, it is most likely for the concentrator's temperature to rise. It is therefore advisable to place a concentrator at least 1 to 2 feet away from the wall and other obstacles because it needs enough space to circulate the air and it tends to get hot upon continuous use. This will then result in the concentrator raising an alarm or even shutting down. Remember that some concentrators have thermosensors installed in them. While working in the field, we came across an Olive 5 concentrator that had an overheating issue. Upon assessment, we realized that the problem was that the ventilation holes at the bottom of the concentrator were blocked, and this was causing the heat to accumulate inside the concentrator. So it is always advised to make sure that you are not covering the ventilation holes and that you keep enough distance to any objects that can obstruct the airflow. I want to believe that this was the issue with your concentrator, and that's why it never raised an alarm when you're observing it, because you changed its surrounding when it was moved out of the wards to the workshop. Thank you, Mari.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for that answer. I hope that helps to fix your problem. So in case some of us have some questions or comments that we'd like to make on that response, we are always free to make those comments. All right, seems we do not have any questions there, so we'll be proceeding with our questions. So our next question says, I am an intern at a certain district hospital in the southern region of Malawi. A 40 Canter V8 was brought to our maintenance workshop, and after troubleshooting, we came to find out that the water had entered the sieve beds due to lack of one-way valves. The sieve bed filters got damaged in the process and could not be reused in the refilling process. Is there an alternative piece of material I can use for sieve bed filters in order for me to refill the sieve beds? So I will ask Cynthia to respond to this one.
Thank you, Mari. So sieve bed filters are installed inside the sieve bed and on both ends of the bed. They exist in different sizes based on the size of the sieve bed, and they are also made of varying materials. They trap dust that try to enter the sieve beds, and in most sieve beds, they are made of soft paper. When refilling the sieve beds, the filters need to be changed. If there is too much dust in these sieve beds, they block the passage of air, thereby affecting the concentrator's performance. In some cases, like in your case, when water reaches the sieve beds, the filters will come in contact with the water, which can end up in damaging the sieve bed filters. When refilling these types of beds, replace the damaged filters with new ones, or if you don't have replacement filters, as in your case, then you can scavenge the filters from other sieve beds which are not in use. If you do not have sieve beds where you can scavenge from, then you can also use clean cotton cloth. Make sure that the cotton cloth is folded into multiple layers in order to make it better filter. Thank you, Mari.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for that response. So this problem, we have also seen it a lot in the Canter V8. So it seems there was actually an issue with the sieve bed design that was leading to that. So yeah, thank you very much for that response. But if we have some questions from audience, we are always free to ask those questions. So we also have a poll at the end of this question. So Amapli, if you please launch that poll.
Yes, I will do. And while I do that, do you want to just remind everyone how to access the poll?
Yes. So if you're joining us from your laptop, if you go to the bottom right of your screen, the icon on the far right is the activities button. So if you click on the activities button, a window opens up where the pause option is one of the listed options. If you are joining us using your mobile phone, then you also go on the bottom right of your screen. You click on the options menu, and that will open up a window where the activities button is one of the listed options. So once you click on the activities button, it should be able to take you to a window where you'll be able to access the pause menu.
Okay, so our poll question was, have you ever replaced sieve bed filters? And most of our votes are on no, actually. So it seems like this is not something that our technicians are familiar with.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amakri. So we'll be moving on with our questions. So our next question says, I am a biomedical technician and I am working on an AirSafe Elite oxygen concentrator that is producing very low oxygen purity. I have serviced the sieve beds and the compressor and fixed existing leaks, and purity has improved from 36% to 72%. I have zeolites that will fit into one sieve bed. Will the purity improve if I only fill one sieve bed? So I will ask Kowinda to respond to this one.
Thanks, Moabi. So, under certain conditions, it is possible that one seabed can be contaminated of the two beds. An example of such case would be when a pipe fitting going to one seabed is loose or damaged, that it lets the outside air get into the contact with the molecular sieve, zeolite. So zeolite gets damaged by humidity of greater than 50%. As such, it should always be handled in the areas where are less than 50% humid. In this case, the outside air will contaminate the zeolite as the humidity of the air is not controlled. In your case, however, I doubt if one seabed could be more severely damaged than the other. Some of the zeolite contaminants are moisture and dust. If you have a combination of two beds where one bed contains old zeolite and the other contains new zeolite, you are very likely to contaminate the seabed with new zeolite. Moist and dust can move from the bed contaminated old seabed to the bed filled with the new zeolite during the pressure equalization and purging phase, because at the time of equalization, the 98% of the oxygen goes to the tank, and the 2% that equalizes the pressure between the two seabeds, so that will go to the other seabed that can damage that zeolite. So pressure equalization allows air to flow from the bed that is being fed to the bed that was being purged with the aim to increase pressure of the depressurized bed. Purging is the process whereby nitrogen molecules are desorbed by venting the seabed to the atmosphere, thereby reducing the pressure and the absorptive force. In your case, we will recommend you to wait until you have zeolite that can be enough to refill both seabeds, regardless that you have only one damaged seabed. It is a good practice to change the whole pair of seabeds. So thank you, Mavi.
Thank you very much, Kowinda, for that answer. I hope that was clear enough. But if you have some follow-up questions or comments that you'd like to make, we are always free to make those comments. Right, it seems we do not have some comments there, so we will be moving on with our questions. So our next question says, I am a biomedical technician, and in the past week, I was testing concentrators that were stored for a few months, so they can be used. Most of them had low purity, and sieve beds needed replacing, even though they had only been used for about 1,600 hours. So it is to my knowledge that molecular sieve should last for about 10,000 hours. What could have caused their short lifespan? So I will ask Daphne to answer this one.
All right. Thank you, Maui. So the lifespan of molecular sieve, also known as zeolite, largely depends on our daily use. This is because temperature, humidity, and dust in the air will contaminate the molecular sieve and reduce its absorption capacity. As such, we need to pay attention to the environments that we use and store our concentrators. Some of the things that can be done include cleaning the intake filter every week and replacing the secondary filter about every 1,000 hours to avoid mixing dust into the molecular sieve. Similarly, not using oxygen concentrators in environments that are too humid. Most oxygen concentrators only operate when needed and therefore spend a majority of their lifespan powered off and in storage, as is your case. Unless the storage environment is climate controlled, temperatures vary between day and night. Some oxygen concentrators have valves that remain open when it's powered off. During the temperature changes, open valves will allow ambient air and nitrogen to be exchanged in and out of the sieve beds. In high temperatures, dry nitrogen gas exists in the environment, and at low temperatures, moisture in the air is absorbed, contaminating the zeolite sieve beds and reducing its absorption capacity. This results in the reduction in concentration of oxygen produced. And this can be avoided by using concentrators with valves that close when powered off, such as the air safe. In cases where you have concentrators with valves that remain open when switched off, storing them in well-sealed cabinets or closets or climate-controlled rooms that prevent temperature variations will help. It should also be noted that concentrators with multifunction valves leave at least one pathway open to the sieve bed at all times, unlike valve configurations like the one used in unlike valve configurations like the ones used in the air sub valves, which independently close off each valve so there are no open pathways to the sieve bed. In multifunctional valves, the feed and exhaust pathways for the two sieve beds alternate between each being opened and closed, but never close at the same time to fully protect the sieve beds. For example, the valves in the Olive 5. Thank you, Mari.
Thank you very much, Daphne, for that response. I hope that helped to answer your question. So we'll now be moving on to our next question, unless if we have some questions or comments that we would like to make on this question, we are always free to make those comments. All right, no questions. So the next one says, while working on a Sylvie oxygen concentrator that was producing low purity, I discovered that one sieve bed was continuously producing air. What can be the problem and how can I solve this problem? So I will ask Cynthia to respond to this one.
Thanks, Maui. Oxygen concentrators use pressure swing absorption technique to separate nitrogen from air under pressure. During this process, one sieve bed of the concentrator is pressurized to produce oxygen, whilst the other bed of the concentrator is resting as it is depressurizes. The concentrator has 4 wear valves that help achieve this process, and depending on the model, other concentrators have block valves whilst others have rotary valves. The valves will open and close depending on the signal received from the board of the concentrator. During the feed phase, one of the sieve bed, the feeding valve of that bed will receive a signal to open, and the feeding valve of the other closes, opening the waste valve. This process happens simultaneously. Coming back to your question, the sieve bed that continuously produces air might be that the feeding valve is not receiving the signal from the board for it to close. To solve this problem, you can try to replace the board with a new one and see if it will start responding. If the same sieve bed is still producing air, measure the resistance of the coil on the valve, as it might be 40 and it needs replacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for that response. And I hope the explanation was clear. But if we have some questions or comments that we would like to make, as usual, we're always free to make those comments. So we also have another poll at the end of this question. So Amapreet, please launch that one.
Yes, so this poll question is, have you ever encountered a scenario where your sieve beds are continuously producing air? And we'll give everyone a few minutes to answer that question. So far, it looks like our votes are very mixed. Yes, Maui. So our votes are 50-50 on this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So just out of curiosity, for those that voted that they have encountered this scenario, would you please share with us what you did to solve that problem? So let's just take a few minutes on this one before we proceed with our questions. So you can just come off mute and explain to us what you did on that. Okay, it seems we have a quiet audience.
Yes, we have replaced the circuit. We have replaced both the parts. Sometimes the valve is faulty. Some other times the voltage is not supplied to the valve from the circuit board. So we have replaced both the parts in different scenarios. No? So it may be 50-50, I think. Sometimes the valve is faulty. Some other time the control board is not supplying the voltage to the valve. So both the cases we have seen here.
Okay, thank you very much, Kowinda. So another issue that we also came across was an issue with the rotary valves. So if the sensor on the rotary valve gets damaged, then you find that the rotary valve will just keep rotating, or it will just stick to one position. So that might also be an issue with that, and we managed to solve that one by just replacing the sensor on the rotary valve that senses the positioning. All right, so we'll now take a slight break from our questions, and we'll now jump onto our topic of interest. So today we'll be talking about pilot valves, and Mteto will be taking us through that explanation. So over to you, Mteto.
Thank you so much, Maui. Hello, everyone again. So we thought about it that in most of the answers that we have been giving out to oxygen concentrators, we've been talking about these pilot valves. So we thought it wise that maybe we should share and just try explain how these valves work and where they are found. So maybe just to begin with, oxygen concentrators have depending on the model, might use either a rotary valve or a solenoid valve. So under the solenoid valve is where we find the pilot solenoid valves. So on to the next slide. So just an introduction. So solenoid valves are the most frequently used control elements in fluidics. Their task is to shut off, release, dose, distribute, or mix fluids. So in this setup, we're talking about the fluids and gases. On to the next slide. So solenoid valves in oxygen concentrators, like for most models of oxygen concentrators, apart from air-safe that has like an equalizer valve, these solenoid valves are found between the compressor and the sieve beds. So their job is to actually channel the air from the compressor to the sieve bed during the feed cycle, and from the sieve beds to the atmosphere during the waste cycle. So at this moment, during the waste cycle, it's mostly the nitrogen that is absorbed by the zeolite that is pushed to the atmosphere. So it is good to know that these solenoid valves come in different configurations. There are so many, but I just picked up a few of them, which are very common. So if you could go to the next slide. So the first configuration is known as the five-way valve. So the five-way valve, as you can see there, it has 5 ports. So sometimes you come across where they say 5/2-way valve. So the 5 means it's the ports where we have the air being released or passing through. But then the 2 is the position. So it means that the valve has 2 positions. So you can have the first position connecting the ports to the left, and then when it moves to the second position, it's connecting to the ports to the right. Yeah. So moving on to the second configuration. So the second configuration is the 3-way valve. So this 3-way valve, you can also see there that it has like 3 ports. So I won't go deep in there because I think the illustration is showing how it's configured. And then the other one is the 4-way valve. So I didn't share this on the graphics, but I mean, a good example of the 4-way valve is the valve we find in an air cell. So we know that there's like a 4-way valve broke sitting on the air-safe oxygen concentrator. So moving on to the next slide, the fourth one is the 2-way valve. So this one is very common. So this one has like just like 2 ports. So there's air coming in and then air is going out. Yeah. So basically, those are the most common configurations of solenoid valves you are going to come across, more especially in oxygen concentrators. So talking of configurations, now we move on to talk about like solenoid valve power states. So to the next slide. So the first like solenoid valve power state is the normally closed one. So as the name itself is self-explanatory. So the plunger, the one that is on the middle there, stays down until the voltage required is applied. So we see there's like a black and red wire there. So if you apply voltage, depending on the model, it might be a 24 volts solenoid valve or a 12 watts. That plunger um, is lifted up when we apply that amount of voltage. So at that moment, when the plunger goes up, it means that the inlet port and the outlet port are connected, so air can pass through. So that's basically about the normally closed. So when there's no power, remember that the plunger will stay down. And then moving on to the next state is the normally open. So the normally open is the one that stays up until the required voltage is applied. So it means that when we now apply some voltages, it's gonna drop down. So it's literally closing the inlet port and the outlet port. Yeah. So the other one is bistable. So I didn't illustrate this, of course, because it's very interesting. So this is switched. This is switched by momentary power supply, and it then stays at that position when there is no power. So it is not normally open or normally closed, as it stays in the current position when there's no power applied. So imagine that the valve was open. So when you remove the power, that valve is going to stay open. Same as when it was closed. When you remove the power, the valve will stay closed. So that's why it doesn't have like normally open and normally closed. So this is achieved by using a permanent magnet rather than the spling we saw in the previous illustrations. Yeah. So from the above states that I've just mentioned, it is good to know that most of the oxygen concentrators, they use the normally closed ones. Of course, you might find some that are normally open, but I think they are rare. So those are like the states of solenoid valves. So let's now talk about the types of solenoid valves. So starting with the first one is direct acting solenoid valve, the one we see in the illustration. So the second one is pilot operated solenoid valve. So this is like our main focus. So if you could go to the previous slide. Um, so the main difference is that direct acting solenoid valves have a direct connection with the opening and closing armature, whereas pilot operated valves use process fluid to assist in piloting operation of the valves. So you can see there in the illustration that there's just wires connected to the solenoid valve um, going, and then we have a spring and a plunger, nothing else. So these adhere to the simple working principles. So you apply power, it goes up or it goes down. So they do not have any diaphragm. Their plunger is part of the seal. So when the plunger is up, it means we are opening the gap between the inlet port and the outlet port, and they will remain closed when there is no pressure. The pressure is not applied. So just to talk about the benefits of this type of direct acting valves, these are suitable for negative pressure projects. So a good example would be like vacuums. So if you have a project that is dealing with vacuums, you might as well just stick to these direct acting valves. And they are designed to cope with particle debris. They are available in very cost effective compact sizes. So you can get a very, very big direct acting solenoid valve at a good price. And there is like a miniature versions available for very high pressures. So moving on to um, the next type of solenoid valve, which is a pilot operated valve. So this is the one we are interested in. So these valves utilize system line pressure to open and close the main orifice in the valve body. So those the graphics we see there is just a step-by-step illustration of how this pilot valve works. So while the solenoid valve is not energized, the diaphragm will be pushed downwards, creating a seal to the outlet port, hence um, not allowing air to pass through. So when there's like air on the inlet port, you can see the arrows that are pointing down. That's the diaphragm there that is curved there. So on the outlet port, there's nothing. So the blue pad is more like illustrating the air or any fluid. Yeah. So on the step number 2 is where now the solenoid valve is energized. So the plunger goes up, and then some little amount of air passes through the pilot hole going to the outlet port. So after that, um, like over time, the pressure builds in the outlet port that creates like a difference in pressure between the inlet port and the outlet port, pushing up the diaphragm, and then the air now passes through to the outlet port. So with this explanation, it clearly shows that these pilot operated valves um, can only work in one direction of flow. So the principle will not work if it's reversed. So imagine that you now introduce air on the outlet port going to the inlet port. It means that the physics there is disturbed and you won't have the valve operating properly. So it's very good to make sure that when we are even installing in the oxygen concentrator, we follow where the inlet is and the outlet is. Yeah. So of course, for like direct acting valves, you can reverse the ports. That will work fine. So some of the benefits of pilot operated valves is that they they are excellent for very large flows. Pressure assists the valve operations, as we have seen that we need some little pressure going through the pilot hole and needs minimum pressure differential. It's not like you need so much pressure to create the pressure differential between the inlet port and the outlet port, and more economical for higher flow values. And these valves use very less current, so they have lower electrical power level. So it's also important to note that oxygen concentrators use both types of solenoid valves, both the direct acting valves as well as the pilot operated valves. So moving on to the next slide. So how do we identify a type of solenoid valve used in an oxygen concentrator? How do you know that this is a direct acting valve or this is a pilot operated valve? So just to speak of the direct operating valve, the valve will draw much current because it's fighting to lift the whole big plunger, and this makes it to have low resistance value. So for example, is a solenoid valve block found in an ASF. So these valves have like low resistance value as compared to other concentrators that use pilot operated valves.
An ASF valve block uses 200 volts. Hence, we cannot do a side-by-side comparison with most pilot valves as they use 12 volts. But a 12 volts direct acting valve from an OD5 oxygen concentrator measures around 49 ohms.
So moving on to the last slide. So for pilot valves or pilot operated valves, the valve draws less current, and this makes it to have a higher resistance value. So a good example would be a respironics concentrator. So this graphic we see there, this was an image that was taken from sieve beds that has the pilot valve connected to the sieve bed there.
Unlike direct acting valve from our Node 5, 12 volts pilot operated valve from Respironics measures resistance of 390 ohms
and can be easily identified by searching the part number. And if you could see there on the right side, the graphics literally show that this is, let's say, a 4/3. So that means it's a 4-way, 3 positions, internal pilot operated solenoid valve, normally closed. So remember that whenever you want to replace like these pilot valves, you need to pay attention to that type of valve and make sure that they match up, and that will work for you. Otherwise, that's basically about these valves, the pilot operated valves. And I know the direct acting valves are straightforward. So thank you so much, Maui.
Thank you very much, Mteto, for that very informative explanation. I knew about the pilot valves, but then I had trouble understanding them, and this has just helped to open up my understanding. So I hope it's the same for you as well. But in case we have some questions or comments that would like to ask Mteto on the presentation that he has just given us, we are always free to ask those questions. So just a reminder, I see that we have a couple of new faces. So in case this is your first time, I'd like to welcome you to the Concentrator Talk call. So we normally hold these calls every Thursday from 2 to 3 p.m. Central African time. So we always encourage you to send questions to us in advance if you have any issues. We also encourage you to share your email addresses with us so that we can add you to our mailing list. So you can do that in the chat. Just drop your email address and just let us know where you're joining from, and then we'll add you to our mailing list. So we'll be sending you frequent updates from the Oxygen Alliance and reminders of the next Concentrator Talk call. All right, so now to get back to our questions. So our next question says, I am a biomedical technician working at a private hospital in Malawi. As I was servicing a 515 oxygen concentrator, I misplaced a tube that joins the right and left sievebed, as shown on the top right corner in the image that contains an orifice. So in order to continue working, I replaced the tube with a tube that had no orifice. After servicing, I ran the concentrator for some time and checked the oxygen purity, which never got above 70%. Then I got a tube with an orifice from another concentrator and replaced it with the oxygen and replaced it. Then the oxygen purity got up to 93%. Can someone explain to me why why is the use of this orifice and how the absence affects purity? So I will ask Aubrey to respond to this one.
Thank you, Maui. The function of the orifice is to allow a small amount of oxygen to flow through it from the pressurized bed into the depressurizing bed. This helps purge the nitrogen from the depressurizing bed. With the assistance of the purging, the zeolite in the depressurized bed becomes free from nitrogen at a faster rate and ready to absorb nitrogen in the next cycle. If no air is introduced into the depressurized bed, it means zeolite releases the nitrogen at a lower speed, such that some of the nitrogen remains in the bed until the next cycle comes. If the cycle duration is maintained, the filtration process is affected. Therefore, you have to increase the cycle duration if you are not introducing air into the depressurized bed so that you can let the zeolite release all the nitrogen. However, this is not good because for continuous smooth flow of air, the cycle has to be as fast as possible. Although the orifice allows the passage of air into the depressurized bed, the airflow is restricted such that pressure buildup in the pressurized bed is not affected. If you remove the orifice, it means there is no restriction in the airflow between the beds. Hence, there will be a high flow of air from the pressurized bed into the depressurized bed, which in turn affects the pressure buildup in the pressurized bed. Changing the size of the orifice will also have an effect on the airflow. If pressure in the pressurized bed does not build up to the required pressure, then the produced oxygen purity is affected, and mostly it will be less than the expected purity. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, for that explanation. I hope that helps to answer your question. But in case we have some follow-up questions from the audience, we are free to ask those questions or make those comments if at all we have them. So we also have another poll at the end of this question, so please let's respond to it once it pops up.
Thanks, Maui. So our poll question is, did you know that changing the size of the orifice would give you a different result? And we will give everyone a little bit of time to answer that question. I am very brave to say that I did not know that, so I appreciate the explanation and the question. But it seems like everyone here on that's a part of our auction talk. Much more of you are technical than I am. So far, all of our votes are for yes.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll be moving on to our next question. So our next question says, I am working on a Dvibis 525 concentrator that was overheating after 20 minutes. During the maintenance process, I noticed the fan was 40. So I replaced the fan with a new one, but the concentrator is still overheating. What could be the cause and the solution to this problem? So I will ask Paulina to answer this one.
Thank you, Moibi, for the question. Every oxygen concentrator has a fan or fans, and usually the fan is located next to the compressor. This is because its purpose is to cool the compressor and ensure that the recommended working temperature range is maintained inside the oxygen concentrator. The recommended working temperature range varies with the brand and model of the compressor. For the Dvibis 525 compressor, the temperature range is 5 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. When the fan is faulty, the compressor overheats, just like it did in your case, and eventually shuts down. This is mainly because every compressor has a thermal switch that switches off the compressor once a particular threshold temperature is reached. In this case, the temperature was above 40 degrees Celsius. To fix a faulty fan problem, one needs to replace it with a new one. When replacing the fan, take note of the AC or the DC voltage and the power rating. Interchanging these can end up damaging the fan even though it is brand new. Apart from the voltage and the power ratings, also take note of the orientation of the fan by checking the two arrows that are placed on the fan. One indicates the direction of the rotation of the blades and the other indicates the direction of airflow. The placement of the fan in the concentrator affects whether it blows cold air into the concentrator from the external surrounding or sucks out hot air from the concentrator to the external surrounding. If you look at the image on screen, it is the airflow. The diagram, the image on screen shows the airflow direction arrow and the blade rotation direction arrows on a 120 millimeter AC cooling fan. The way the fan is placed varies in different concentrator brands. For the DeVilbiss brand, the fan is placed in such a way that it sucks hot air from the concentrator to the external surround. When the orientation is reversed, it blows in air from the external surrounding into the concentrator, and this slows down the air circulation, which leads to overheating after a particular period of time. So to fix the above stated problem, you would have to now check how you've placed the fan inside of the concentrator when you're installing it. Check if the orientation is correct, and also check the power rating of that fan. If the orientation and the power rating is correct, then you would also need to look at some of the parts that could cause overheating in the machine, which could be the compressor itself that is overheating, the thermistor that is overheating, or also check if there are any blockages, any filter that could be causing a blockage and causing overheating in the machine. Thank you, Mwabi.
Thank you very much, Paulina, for that explanation. I see we have Hadia in the chat. You say you have a question. You can come off mute and ask a question, please. Hadia, are you there with us? We can't hear you. Okay, so I've pasted a question in the chat that's saying, what are the common problems, or what are the common problems that occur on the solenoid valves? So MT, since you explained about the valves, do you mind answering this question?
Maui, I think MT had to go back into the ward. I don't think he's with us anymore.
Okay, all right. So anyone from the technicians panel is free to take up this question.
Sorry, power, that the solenoid valve problem can be due to power fluctuations also, or can be due to blockage in the vena. that makes a back pressure, over pressure type, that can cause the fault in the solenoid valve also. Or on the manifold side, if there is any problem on the because the exhaust filter is also placed beyond that valves, huh? If that is choked, that can cause this problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Kuwinda. So one other problem that I've also come across is that there are situations where you find that the filters in the sieve beds get damaged, and that makes the zeolites move into the solenoid valve. So if for some reason you get some moisture into the solenoid valve, the zeolite hardens and then it just blocks the movement of the solenoid valve. So that's also another issue that you might encounter with these solenoid valves. So in case you come across that, then if you just open up the valve, disassemble it and clean it up, it should be able to fix that problem. I hope that answers your question, Hadia. All right. If you have some follow-up questions, you can just you can send them to us through our email address. I think it was pasted in the chat at the beginning of the call. I'm afraid maybe you can just paste it again so that people don't have trouble finding it. So looking at our time, we had one extra question, but then we have run out of time, so we don't want to keep you longer than you plan to be here. So we'll stop here and then we will keep the last question for the next session. So I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us for the call today. It's always wonderful to see you here every time. If you have questions that you want us to help you out with, you can always send them to us in advance, or you can ask them during the call. If we have the time, we can always answer them during the call. If we don't, then we try as much as possible to answer them during the next session. So we have a YouTube channel where we post all the recorded sessions of the previous Concentrator Talk calls. So if you happen to have missed one, then you can just go on YouTube and search for Oxygen Alliance, and then you'll be able to access all our videos from there. And please don't forget to subscribe when you get to the channel. We also have a website, so we also, some of the information that we share on the call is posted on the website. So please also have a look at that. I'm afraid if you would paste the link in the chat. So reaching this far, I'm afraid, unless if you have something maybe before we end the call.
Yes, I will make a quick announcement. So we have our series of talks called the Oxygen Talk, where we invite experts from outside of just concentrator repair to come and speak to us, more of a presentation and instead of a question and answer session like we have our concentrator talks. So I am very, very excited to announce for all of us today that our next Oxygen Talk will be the last week of July. That will be July 28th. And we will have guest speakers from DeVilbiss speaking with us. We'll have their some senior technicians and their director of respiratory products talking to us about changes that they've made in the product, as well as unique features and spare parts that they have and how to troubleshoot and repair those items. So we do, I think we all see a lot of DeVilbiss units on in the field, and we are very excited to have them come and join us in 2 weeks to talk about what they've learned and what they know about the product so that we can all learn from them.
Great. Thank you very much, Amaprit, for that announcement. So I hope you put it on your calendars so that you don't miss it. Or you can just share your email address with us, and then we'll send you a reminder a day before the call. So reaching this far, I would like to wish you a great weekend, and we will see you again in our next Concentrator Talk call. Goodbye.